Security International, Mr. Nelson's office. Hi, sorry to bother you. Is Jeff Nelson still there? This is Eric Murphy. I'm sorry, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Nelson is in conference. Tell him we got a deal, but I need to talk to him for just a minute. Eric took a deep breath and held it. Mr. Murphy, you're beginning to prove bothersome, Nelson said, coming on the line without greeting. Eric could see his smug face sneering at him, as if he were really there, but he managed to keep his tone normal. Nelson, I've changed my mind. I'd like to take you up on your offer, if it's still open, he said flatly. You were so adamant earlier. I have to ask myself, why? Nelson answered skeptically. Well, Eric started. You're right, I'm not my brother. It would be a lot simpler if I just took you up on your offer. I still can't seem to get a hold of Jack Braggs, and I wouldn't know what to do with the gold if it is there, and I did find it. Sounds like a lot of work that might not pan out to me. Your offer makes it a win-win, Eric concluded cautiously. A wise decision, Mr. Eric. A wise decision indeed. I only have two stipulations, Eric said, taking a deep breath. One, that briefcase full of cash up front. And two, I don't want the house trashed looking for the map since restoring it was the last thing Sean ever did. Give me till the end of the week to find it. Then, I'll turn it over to you when you return. You, and only you, not one of your associates. Eric held his breath, waiting for the answer. And if you don't find the map, Nelson questioned, then your people can search the house board by board, and I won't stand in their way. I just want a chance to preserve my brother's last project. How touching, Nelson said sarcastically. I don't see a problem with your conditions, provided you don't try to cross me, and I don't think you're that stupid. The cash was yours to take when you were here earlier. Waiting a few days might be best, then I can oversee the work myself, Nelson intoned, thinking out loud. All right, Mr. Eric, I accept your conditions. We have a deal then. Yes, Eric responded eagerly. Good. Well, just come back and get your goods then. Well, Eric began slowly. There is a slight problem there. I'm running short on time too right now. Can your secretary bring the briefcase and meet me at the first Arlington Metro station on the eastbound platform past your location toward DC? A long silence filled the phone line. Eric exited the freeway at the last moment, heading for the last Arlington Metro station, anticipating the answer he wanted. Just when Eric thought Nelson had hung up, he got his reply. Eric, Nelson said slowly, certainly you understand all these melodramatics are unnecessary, but as you wish. She can be there in 20 minutes, I think. Does that suit you? Perfectly, Eric answered, grinning. Good. Now, Eric, I'm a busy man. I'll be in touch by the end of the week. If you find anything, leave word here at the office. 20 minutes. The line went dead. Eric parked quickly, lucking into a spot in the nearly filled to capacity lot, and jogged into the station. After referring to the map of the metro station, he purchased his travel card and boarded the westbound train. Eric used the time on the short ride to study the crowd. Everyone seemed in their own little world. Nobody else existed. And to run through the plan in his head. He had no idea if it would work, or if he was just being paranoid. But someone had known what Sean and Abby were up to, and they had paid dearly for it. He arrived at his destination with only a couple minutes to spare, and had to hurry up the escalator and through the turnstile to get over to the eastbound platform. Eric had been on the platform only a minute when he spotted the secretary he remembered from Nelson's office coming down the escalator, flanked front and rear by two very capable-looking, hard-eyed military types. She approached him directly. The two guerrillas took up defensive positions a discreet distance away. Smiling as she walked up to him, she scolded, Mr. Murphy, you forgot your briefcase. You'll need it for your meeting, she said, acting like the efficient secretary she no doubt was. Eric took the offered briefcase, trying to remember the nameplate on her desk. Oh, thank you, Miss Perkins. Eric turned to move down the platform as the rumble of an approaching train sounded in the distance. A hand on his arm stopped him. Mr. Murphy, check your bag to make sure the contracts are there, she ordered, smiling, but her eyes serious. She supported the case while Eric flipped the latches and opened the case only partially, seeing the banded green bills. He closed it, not wanting to advertise its contents to everyone on the platform. It all seems in order, Miss Perkins. Thank you. He took the case, shaking her hand. You're welcome, Mr. Murphy. We wanted no mix-ups. You understand. She smiled benignly. Perfectly, he answered, turning to enter the nearest car of the train that was just pulling to a stop. Eric turned to say thanks over his shoulder, but the secretary and the bodyguards were already making their way off the platform, mingling with the train's departing passengers. The door hissed shut, and the train began to accelerate smoothly out of the station. Eric found a seat directly opposite the door and sat down, clutching the briefcase tightly to his chest. Eric tried not to think about what he was doing. He was sitting on a subway train with $1 million check in his pocket and carrying another $1 million around in a briefcase. God, I must be out of my mind, he thought. He scanned the other passengers. He couldn't tell if he was just being paranoid, or if there really was another passenger further down the aisle that was eyeing him up. Eric took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't do this, he thought. I'll never pull this off. Then he heard Sean's voice scolding him. You given up already? You think you're beat? You are. You think you're going to lose? You will. Relax. Think. React. Above all, never, ever quit. And drive on till you get there. His stop was coming up, but he sat still. He looked down the aisle at the man he thought was watching him. Eric's chest tightened. The train pulled to an easy stop, and the doors hissed open. Passengers began departing, but Eric sat still until the last possible moment before the doors hissed shut. Then he darted out of the door, still clutching the briefcase to his chest. He glanced back and saw his shadow elbowing his way out of the car. Eric drew abreast of the door of the last car. As it began to slide away from the platform, he chanced to glance over his shoulder. His shadow was looking his way with murderous intent in his eyes as the train slid into the tunnel. Eric allowed himself a brief smile as he sat calmly, trying to think through his next step. He got on the next train, headed for the next stop. The coast looked clear, so Eric detrained there and flip-flopped again, heading west back to the station where he left his car. After a few nervous moments at the station, Eric was afraid he'd turn a corner and run into his tail. He was safe and secure in his car, headed towards DC on 66, his briefcase in the back, under the protective, that's a laugh, cover. He checked his watch. Shit, he cursed, realizing now he was running late. Traffic had thinned, and he made good time covering the last few miles. Moments after sighting the Washington Monument, his destination, the Lincoln Memorial, came into view. Jesse was right in coming this way. I can't miss it, he thought, as he crossed the Potomac, the Lincoln Memorial now looming over him to his right. He went to the exit and drove around the memorial, but realized at the last instant that doing so would take him back across another bridge, this one directly to Arlington Cemetery, back across the Potomac, and that the road directly around the memorial was closed to all but tour bus traffic. After an immediate lane change to the left, several blown horns, and squealing brakes, Eric found himself on Constitution Avenue, looking for a place to park among the relentless stream of tourists, flocking to the nation's capital on a warm spring day. He saw a long space up ahead, and quickly pulled in. Looking with disgust and growing frustration, he realized the next sign that indicated the Vietnam Memorial. There was a sign that stated, "Bus parking only, Monday to Friday, 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. God damn it, Eric swore, looking to see if he could squeeze forward to back out of the bus towaway zone. Behind him was a handicapped van. In front of him a familiar-looking Cadillac. They all looked the same anyway, he thought. The Cadillac had disregarded the towaway zone and was parked well within the designated bus area. Eric looked around frantically for a place to open up, realizing he was now late. Just as he was attempting to pull back into traffic, the sight of two large military types, all but dragging a young woman towards the Cadillac, caught his eye. He let out a gasp. "Jesse, hardly recognizing the girl he had met only yesterday. Without thinking, he cut the wheel to the right and floored the accelerator. With the protesting sound of squealing tires, the Z shot over the curb. Narrowly missing a light post and sign, he headed directly for the trio heading to the Cadillac. The two goons stopped in their tracks for an instant, their heads swiveling towards the onrushing Camaro. Jessie picked that instant to jerk free, swinging her carry-all pack viciously at the head of one while kicking the other one in the shin. The two men dove between the cars, and Jessie dove into the grass. Eric reached over, opening up the door, screaming frantically for Jessie to get in, while keeping an eye out for her assailants. Jessie tossed in her pack and scrambled into the car as Eric hit the gas, fishtailing and churning up the well-kept grass before rocketing down the sidewalk, scattering pedestrians and a couple of vendors before he saw a break in the line of parked cars to his left. He then cut back onto the street. He risked a quick glance in the rearview mirror to see the two assailants giving up chase. One of them had turned back. Eric guessed to get the car. "You're late," Jessie scolded as Eric made a sharp right onto 17th Street to head across the mall between the reflecting pole and the Washington Monument. "Which way?" Eric chirped, almost in panic, having no idea where he was heading. "Right," Jessie responded automatically, seeing traffic backing up ahead with only the right turning lane clear. The tires squealed in protest as Eric managed the corner, hardly slowing at all, to head back toward the Lincoln Memorial on Independence from the other side of the mall. Eric slowed to move with normal traffic, since no sign of a chase was evident. To be on the safe side, he made a left as he approached the Lincoln Memorial, heading south to Basin Drive towards the Jefferson Memorial, away from the mall area. Jessie twisted in the seat, looking out the rear window. "Doesn't look like anybody's back there. I think you lost them," she said, twisting back to sit in the front seat, breathing a sigh of relief. "Hey, wait a minute. This isn't the way back home or to Georgetown. Where are we going?" she questioned, puzzled. "A lot's happened," Eric replied without explanation, concentrating on the road signs. After a minute, satisfied with his heading, he looked at her saying, "We're headed to Norfolk." "But I can't," she started to protest. "Jack Braggs is dead," he said, cutting her off. Jessie began to tremble, and her eyes grew wide. "Jack's dead?" she repeated, almost whispering. "No, no." She began to cry softly. Suddenly her eyes grew wider, and she grabbed his arm, startling him. "Eric!" Eric guessed that she had just come to the same conclusion he had when hearing of Jack's death. "Yeah, I know," he soothed. "You're the only one left." He looked over at her sympathetically. "I told you a lot's happened. Hey, chin up." He reached over, lifting her chin. "I'm here," he reassured. "And I ain't letting you out of my sight for a minute till we see this thing through. Okay?" "Okay," she squeaked, wiping her tears on her sleeve. "Good. Now that that's settled," he said with more confidence than he felt. He returned his attention to traffic. Jessie slumped against the door, closing her eyes as if exhausted. "Okay, kid, we're gonna do this your way. I got an idea who's behind it, and I think I know where to find the gold. We're gonna bait a trap and suck these sons of bitches into it. So don't go to pieces on me now, kid. Come on, I'm gonna need you on this," Eric coached, trying to put some life back into Jessie. Jessie opened her eyes and gave Eric a pleading, "I can't go on" look. Then she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder, and sobbed. Eric put his arm around her, comforting her, and didn't press her. After a time, the crying stopped, but Jessie didn't move. Miles rolled by, and Jessie held herself there, face buried in Eric's shoulder. Eric was growing comfortable with the idea of his arm around her, and her around him. As they neared Fredericksburg, she stirred, speaking softly. "Eric, I'm scared," she confided. "Yeah, me too, kid," he answered. "But we gotta drive on, scared or not, till it's over," he said through clenched teeth. Jessie sat up and smiled. "You sounded like Sean when you said that." Eric turned red, embarrassed. Well, I guess that's 'cause he said that, or things like that all the time. I never knew what he meant till now." "I'm sorry," she said, touching his hand tenderly. Her touch ignited something in him. He looked at her closely. She was very pretty, the kind of girl he had always been afraid to talk to. Too pretty, too perfect, out of his league. He changed the subject before he said something stupid. So tell me what you found out, he said awkwardly. Oh, I think I can find where the gold is by the descriptions in the diary. At least within 100 yards or so. I think it's less than a quarter mile from the house, she said, beaming, proud of her work. Quarter mile? Hell, it's right in the yard if I got it figured right, Eric contradicted. In the yard? What are you talking about? She shot back defensively. Forget the map. The note explains it. The package is our dreams. Our dreams are in the wishing well. Or something like that. So? So isn't it obvious? The gold is in the well in the picture of Will and Myra. Remember? They're sitting on one of those round wells with the little roof. A wishing well. Jessie shook her head in protest. Wait a minute, Eric. We don't even know where that picture was taken. There's no way to tell if it was taken at Wheatland or not. There's no background but some siding. No windows, no trees. Not to mention there's no well there now. Where was it? You gonna excavate the whole yard? Jessie paused, turned to dig into her backpack, which she had thrown in the bag. Eric just concentrated on the highway, biting his lip and losing confidence in his idea. Listen, Eric, she began while going through the pack. It's not a bad idea. We tossed that one around that night, too. No gold was recovered at the house after the fight, and the explanation of Colonel Mosby said everyone carried off his weight, so maybe Wiltshire is there. But where is there? Jessie smiled, turning back in her seat, satisfied with what she had found. This is one of Myra's diaries. Now the map maid mentioned that the gold was hidden where Wilt had made like a fox and outsmarted the Yankees, that he had hidden somewhere, and they had walked almost on top of him but didn't find him. Okay, Eric shrugged. Well, listen to this, she said, carefully opening the old diary to a marked page. Scanning to the proper place, she began to read. I bade them, do not cast my sweet Wilt into a common hole with the other two, like some dead beast. And after much pleading on my part, they agreed, and fashioned him a simple pine box. We laid him on a knoll overlooking our secret place, where we first kissed, after he showed me how he outsmarted the Yankees, when he made like a fox. He was so full of himself that day, so proud of finding that little cave under the oak. I remember it like it was yesterday, the fever his kiss caused me. So my sweet Will lie there for eternity, and so shall I when my days are over. But until then I will visit him. I vow to gaze on the place, and remember that first kiss. Jessie closed her eyes smiling, and sighed. Isn't it romantic? When he made like a fox and outsmarted the Yankees? Eric repeated, seeming to roll the idea around in his head. Same phrase as used on the map, Eric said, arching his eyebrows at Jessie. That's right, she said, nodding her agreement. Could be a coincidence, but what? Jessie shot back, giving Eric a stern look. But definitely worth looking into. Eric agreed. It gets better, Jessie said, looking like the cat that ate the canary. Yeah? How? I know where the grave is. Eric looked over at her dumbfounded. Did Sean or your mother know this? He asked. No, Jessie said, shaking her head firmly. That was my big news I had uncovered studying Myra's diaries. She looked down at the floor. Before I could tell them, well, you know. Yeah, I know. They rode along in painful silence for a time, each wrestling with their emotions. Eric had the beginnings of a plan taking shape in the back of his mind and was trying to think it through. Jessie contented herself reading Myra's diaries. You know, Myra Connell lived an amazing life in many ways. Her diaries are fascinating. Jessie sighed, breaking the silence. Oh yeah, there must have been a lot of action for a teenage girl back here during the Civil War. Eric snorted sarcastically. That's not what I mean, silly, Jessie said, slapping Eric's arm playfully. Didn't Sean tell you anything about the place after he bought it? Not much, Eric shrugged. Just he bought an old abandoned place that dated back till before the Civil War. Jessie shook her head sadly, then started a dialogue warming to her subject. Well, for one thing, Myra wasn't some sort of teenage camp follower. Everyone that lived in or near the Shenandoah suffered unimaginably back then. especially towards the end of the war. The Yankees burned barns and the crops, slaughtered horses and cattle. The area has been compared to the surface of the moon during the last months of the war. You can't imagine the hardships these people must have endured back then." She paused, reflecting. "Myra survived all that. Did you know she lived until the early 50s? She was over 100 years old when she died. She lived through the Civil War and through Reconstruction. She lived through 3 presidents being assassinated, the invention of the electric light, the telephone, the beginning of flight, motion pictures, 2 world wars, and the atom bomb. And the people she met, or at least saw. She talks about the calm demeanor and charisma that surrounded Robert E. Lee, the dashing, flirtatious, but cruel General Custer, the snappy, arrogant little General Sheridan, and the big, solemn, pious Stonewall Jackson. Oh, and get this," she rattled on. "One of the people Wilt lists being on the raid was named Lewis Powell." "So? Never heard of him," Eric answered. "Didn't you learn anything in American history?" Jessie chided, shaking her head. "Well, Lewis Powell also went by the name Payne. He took it from a family he stayed with over in Paris. Anyway, Wilt has him being in on the raid that produced the gold, and says that they all carried off their share, right?" Eric agreed, noting with satisfaction the light in Jessie's eyes. "Well, according to the history books, Lewis Powell Payne deserted from Mosby's command in January 1865, made his way north, and taking the oath of allegiance, he ended up in Baltimore and tied up with John Wilkes Booth, and was involved in the plot to kill Abraham Lincoln. Powell was to kill Secretary Seward, but failed, was captured and hanged." Now it was Eric's turn to look at her skeptically. "Honest," she said, holding up her right hand. "You know what that means, Eric?" "Huh." Eric grunted, not understanding. "That means if Powell made it north with the share he was carrying, then the gold probably financed President Lincoln's assassination. Mind-blowing, huh?" "Jesus," Eric replied, properly blown away. "She described Powell as quiet, sort of a loner, stopped by a time or two to collect Wilt. She says Wilt told her tales of Powell's terrible ferocity on the battlefield, but he seemed quiet and kind of backward to her. He was always polite, but the way he used to look at her gave her the willies." "You're making this up," Eric accused, hoping to egg her on. He liked the sound of her voice when she talked. "No, I'm not," she defended, clutching the diary to her chest. Okay. Tell me more," he coaxed. The miles were rolling by painlessly as she told her tales. "Well," she thought. "Oh, here's one. Mosby himself stayed at Wheatland for a few days, in December of 1864. Mosby was shot and seriously wounded while eating dinner at a friend's house. He was taken by ox cart to another home where the bullet was removed, then taken to Wheatland to hide out and be cared for until he was able to travel to his father's home near Lynchburg, Virginia. Myra describes him as being almost a corpse. It was a miracle he ever survived. Small, wiry, but tough. She mentions the gold too, in a roundabout way, several times, never coming right out and saying anything. Just, hints. I don't think she believed it was there, because if it was, Will would have found a way to let her know." "But he did," Eric interrupted. "In her own hiding place, in her room." "Yes, he did," Jessie agreed. "But she never looked. She kept that room as kind of a shrine to Will for the rest of her life. Never moved anything or entered it again. She had their servant, little Samuel, put Wilt's rifle and pistols in the closet. Other than that, the room was left untouched. There were bullet holes in the wall, broken glass on the floor and all. Anyway," she continued, "not long after Wilt's death, I know, 'cause it's right after the part about his funeral, 3 of Wilt's comrades paid a visit to Wheatland. Charlie McDough, Nick Carter, and John Perrier. They said their condolences for Wilt, then they started asking odd questions about what he had said and done when he had arrived. They questioned her about the other 2, also. She was quite put out. They ended up threatening her mother, and her father before they left, accusing her of having something that belonged to them. Wilt had it in the broken wagon that stood at the barn's foundation. Myra explained they hadn't been there, and had only arrived home after the Yankees had killed all 3 men, as they had taken Mr. Connell to the Salem doctor after a horse had kicked him. They were looking for the gold. What was going on, anyway? Eric asked, casting a sideways glance at Jessie. Jessie shook her head in agreement, then explained. See, the map is more than a map as such. It's more of a letter of explanation to Colonel Mosby, with a crude map on the back. According to Wilt's explanation, McDowell and Carter organized the raid, without the knowledge of Colonel Mosby. A sort of free enterprise venture, if you will. McDowell and Carter seem to be famous for this sort of thing. Anyway, they recruited a dozen or so men from within the ranks, including 1 officer, Puryear. They had information on a lone wagon packed with something of value that would try and cross the Shenandoah Valley through Chester's Gap and head north. They ambushed the wagon in the gap, killing all its guards. Wilt's guilt and confession came because they found out all the men in the wagon they had killed were Southerners, not Yankees. After taking the wagon, they sent Wilt and the 2 other men with the wagon through the gap to rendezvous with them later at the Blackwell place, an old burnout headquarters they were all familiar with. While the wagon went back through the gap, the others staged a series of attacks on the column that was investigating the skirmish, and led them on a chase in another direction away from the wagon. Apparently the only survivors of that were McDowell, Carter, Puryear, and Powell. Jessie paused for a breath. And Powell deserted. Eric interrupted. And Powell deserted. Jessie agreed, leaving the other 3 to show up at Wheatland, looking for the others when they never showed up at Blackwell's. She finished. Where was Mosby during all of this? Eric asked. Oh, he was still recovering at his father's home from the wound that almost killed him in December. Actually, I think he was on his way back to Richmond. Maybe that's why they thought he was involved, since he may have been in the capital when the gold had been taken. Speaking of Richmond, Jessie nodded towards the sign indicating Richmond. 10 miles as they left the I-95 for the 295 bypass around the state capitol. The story gets crazier by the minute, Eric observed. Jessie agreed, adding, It answers a lot of questions, though. Then she continued on. After the war, Myra mentions Puryear stopping by and apologizing for the day he stopped with Carter and McDowell. She ran him off. He went willingly, but said he stopped by to warn her and her family that McDowell and Carter wouldn't be coming by to atone for their indiscretion, but to beware of the pair. They hadn't surrendered and were now outlaws, and had vowed to come back to Wheatland, where they believed the gold to be. Myra asked about the gold. It was the first time she had heard of it. Puryear declined to explain, but again warned her to beware of the other 2. They're an evil pair, he had said as he parted. So what happened to McDowell and Carter? Eric asked. Jessie shrugged as she continued. They stayed in the area as outlaws, doing pretty much as they had done during the war. Nobody knows why, but looking for the gold makes sense. So what happened to them after that? Jessie responded enthusiastically, as she would with a juicy tidbit of gossip. Well, they never approached Myra again, at least not openly. She caught glimpses of unidentified riders watching the house from a distance. She swears it was them. They also found deep holes dug in odd places around the property, and would occasionally hear noises and see a lantern light in the near distance, as though someone was searching for something. McDowell and Carter, Eric prompted. Jessie shrugged again. Who knows? Myra's not sure. Stories grew of spirits and hauntings, and eventually the legend of Mosby's gold. The only mention of gold Myra ever heard was that one slip by Puryear right at the end of the war. McDowell was hunted down and committed suicide with his last bullet during a shootout with the troops in Middleburg. After that, Carter left the area, finally disappearing in Mexico a couple years later. So it all falls together for the most part. Everyone who knew anything about the gold was dead, or long gone, except for Puryear. What of him? Jessie sighed. Not much. He wrote an article once, for the Confederate Soldiers newspaper, about a raid with McDowell, Carter, and Powell. She smiled at Eric's raised eyebrows. But he talked of Powell's desertion, how, in an emotional dialogue before he rode off, Powell confessed he thought the war was lost. The cause was dead. Better to go north and start over than hang around for a senseless slaughter. Powell said he thought McDowell and Carter would come to a bad end, and Puryear would be smart if he parted company with the two. Powell allegedly said something like, "Mark my words, those two will come to a bad end, probably be hanged. I've had enough of their like. I don't intend to hang for anybody." Jesus, Eric commented. Ironic, huh? He doesn't mention the gold at all. Puryear prospered after the war, ended his days sitting around telling old war stories, and died in 1923. He was well into his 80s then. Jessie stretched, tired from her tale. Can we stop? I need to use the ladies' room, and could use a drink. They were just exiting 295 onto Route 64, on the last leg of their trip. Eric assured her there was a rest area just ahead. Satisfied, Jessie added one last detail. A few years later, though, after McDowell was killed, two boys who had grown up on the next estate to the east, you know, that big square brick place a couple miles up from yours, their father was a foreman up there. Well, for years Myra was always catching the two hanging around watching, almost the way the Riders had. She didn't think anything of it because they were kids. But as they grew into teenagers, they grew bold, surly even. Myra tells one time they burst right into the house and threatened her, asking about the loot her old beau had hid there during the war. They said they know all about it from old Charlie McDowell. They'd been watching the house all this time because he had told them to, and said he'd give them a share when he got it. They figured it should all go to them now. They even brandished a pistol they had claimed they had gotten from Charlie. One of the boys held it to her head, telling her to say her prayers and tell people who treated her so. He said, "This here gun was Charlie McDowell's. It's gonna make me famous one day." They tried molesting her, but she fought furiously, and then Samuel came to her aid. He'd grown up too, and he had thumped the two would-be rapists good before they got the better of him. They were gonna hang him down in the front yard, saying no Negro was gonna lay a hand on them. But by then, Myra broke out her daddy's old shotgun, scaring the two off. Did they ever come back? Eric asked, as he eased over to the right lane to exit the Williamsburg-style brick rest stop area. Eric pulled to a stop. As they got out, Jessie answered, "Nah, they were getting into more and more trouble. They left the area and went west. Myra makes one last mention of the two a few years after that. Their names were Bob and Charlie Ford. Turned out they joined up with the James gang. You know, Frank and Jesse. One of them boys was the one that shot and killed Jesse." Myra commented, "I guess he made his mark with that old pistol after all." With that, Jessie turned and entered the ladies' room. Eric watched her go, then he turned and went over to the men's room. Inside, he went to the sink and washed his face, taking a long look in the mirror. He looked tense and tired, and why shouldn't he after the events of the last week? 10 minutes later, they were back on the road, armed with sodas and candy bars from the rest stop vending machines. "Your turn now," Jessie said, munching on a Snickers bar. "I told you what I found out about the treasure, and threw in a history lesson too. Now, who do you think's behind it, and how do we go about trapping them?" Eric pondered a minute, trying to organize his thoughts as they sped down the highway, lined with tall pines towards Norfolk. "I'm not really sure. It's just a feeling, you know? Too many things don't add up, and the things that do don't seem kosher. Know what I mean?" Jessie sat there looking at him, shaking her head no. "You're not gonna get off that easy," she responded, giving him a come-on, hurry-up look. Okay, but you're gonna have to follow me on this. Some of it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me right now. It's just a gut feeling. Got it?" Okay. Eric started with his arrest and memory loss, the flashbacks to what happened, and the final falling into place of his memory with Jeff Nelson at Security International telling him his good fortune and having heard it before, complimented by two goons in the waiting room looking familiar. That had made his memory click back into place. Eric also outlined the beginning of his plan, telling her of the briefcase full of cash, and produced the $1 million check for his inheritance. By the time they passed the Williamsburg exits, Eric had finished, leaving Jessie sitting there in stunned silence, staring at the zeros on the check. As they slowed for the growing traffic heading into Newport News and Hampton, Jessie shook her head slowly, saying, "This is enough money to run off and start over with. And you say there's this much cash in the back?" Eric nodded dumbly. I suppose you still have that gold bar under your seat? Eric nodded again. Are you crazy? Eric shrugged. Things have been happening too fast. This all happened on my way to meet you, remember? Well, the big money anyway. She looked out the window. They just gave you all this money against the chance they might find the gold? They must think there's a lot there. She paused. I think we're in over our heads, Eric. Security International are some tough customers from what Sean said. They're people like him, ex-SEALs, Rangers, and Special Forces. How can we hope to turn this around on them? Eric looked at her, his expression growing hard, his jaw tightening. Because Sean's, your mom's, and Jack's memories demand it. I wanted to just leave it. Go. Before I found out about Jack, tortured, so was I. Why wasn't I killed? He shook his head, and Sean's old boss seems to be turning up everywhere. A lot of things didn't add up, but Jeff Nelson figures into it somewhere, I'm sure. And don't forget those two guys back in D.C., your two big goons in the caddy trying to drag you away. Sounds like what happened to me all over again. And it sure wasn't the local Boy Scouts. You can bet your ass they were Nelson's goons. I don't know, Eric. I'm scared, she said wistfully. So am I, kid. So am I. Eric reached his arm out. It just seemed natural to do so. She moved closer, taking comfort in his strength. They crossed the Hampton Bay Bridge tunnel into Norfolk before rush hour traffic jammed everything to a stop. They were slowed to a stop by construction at Granbury Street, where they exited catching Little Creek Road at Ward's Corners. They followed the stop-and-go traffic northeast until Little Creek Road ended at Shore Drive. The amphib base where Sean had been stationed for so many years was spread out before them. They took a left heading into the decaying Ocean View section of town.